When I first started weaving, my weaving teacher suggested that we avoid single-ply yarns for warp and only use them in weft because they just weren't beginner friendly. Now, that advice went in one ear and out the other, and I have been weaving with single-ply yarns ever since and enjoying it. In this video, I'm going to talk about why my weaving teacher said that, as well as some reasons why single-ply yarns can actually be a great idea, especially if you're working with handspun yarn. Plus, I'll share some tips and tricks for working with this yarn so that you can weave with success. Hi, I'm Pamela from Fibersprite.com, and I help fiber artists understand what they need to know so they can get down to their real passion, actually working with fiber. For me, the biggest reason why single-ply yarn is a good idea is from a labor perspective. As somebody who spins a lot of my own yarn, plying is one of the most labor-intensive parts of the process. So using single-ply yarn is actually much more efficient. Why is this? When you use a single-ply yarn, all you have to do is spin the one ply and then set the twist. Sure, you need to spin it strong and you need to spin it consistently, and that can be a technical challenge all on its own, but once you've mastered that, you have less work in front of you. If I'm making 100 yards of single-ply yarn, I just have to spin 100 yards. But if I'm making 100 yards of a 2-ply yarn, I need to spin probably closer to 120 yards of the first single, 120 yards of the second single, and then ply them together. Why am I adding an extra 20 yards to each of these? It's because the ply twist actually shortens the length because they're not going in a straight line, they're going in a spiral, and so you're losing some length there. So it's going to take more materials, it's going to triple your time, and it's also going to make a bulkier fabric. That bulkier, thicker fabric might be desirable in some cases. In a lot of instances, the cloth that you get from a single-ply yarn in your warp and your weft is actually going to be more preferable to one that's made with a plied yarn. In fact, take a look around you. Look at your jeans, your dress shirts, maybe even the upholstery on your furniture. A lot of the things in our everyday lives that are woven with single-ply yarns. This isn't because machines know how to do it better than us or they're more talented. It's because it's more efficient. So where is it that we got the idea that single-ply yarns are off limits? It is true that there are some things about single-ply yarns that can be challenging, and this is where my teacher was coming at it with nothing but good intentions, saying to hold off on them for now. But what I think has happened is that we hear hold off on it for now and then just never get around to actually weaving with single-ply yarns because we're scared, we don't want to have something go wrong, and we just want to have those easy wins time after time. Single-ply yarns do have some different properties to plied yarns, and the biggest one of these is the way that the twist exists in the yarn. So this is a freshly spun single, and it's got some extra twist in it, but I've done that on purpose so that you can see what happens when it's cut. So, whoosh! Did you see how it went from being under a lot of tension to not being very tightly spun at all? And in fact, I can kind of drift things apart. When I cut that thread, some of the strength that makes the yarn hold itself together actually went away. Remember, twist is the glue that holds your yarn together, and when you lose the twist, you lose that strength that makes your yarn hold together. Plied yarn, in contrast, is a little bit more stable because the two plies twist against each other and help even each other out. This is that same single, and I've doubled it back on itself, and I'm going to just let the twist naturally form, and that extra twist goes to make a plied yarn. So when I go to cut this yarn that's been plied, it does not lose nearly as much of its twist as the single-ply yarn did. Most of these effects are neutralized once the yarn has been set. If you're working with a commercial single-ply yarn, this has already been done for you. If you're a hand spinner, this means setting the twist with steaming or some kind of wet finishing or sizing your yarn. Even if the effect is mostly neutralized though, the twist is still going to want to travel to the area of least resistance. When we get to warping the loom, this means that a plied yarn yarn will be relatively stable, but single-ply yarns might want to twist back on themselves or even on their neighbors, and this might create twists and snarls and tangles that can be a little bit frustrating, especially if you're warping your loom by yourself, as American weavers tend to do. Another reason that American weavers might tend to avoid using single-ply yarns is because our weaving technology changed in the early 20th century. Traditionally, multi-shaft looms operated on a counterbalance system where all shafts were in action at all times. So if one shaft lifted, then the other would lower at the same time. So you'd have this opening and closing effect where every yarn was essentially under the same amount of tension at all times. This is very gentle on yarn, but can have some drawbacks in the weaving structures that are available to you. In the early 20th century, jack looms were invented, and these offered a lot more flexibility in weaving structures. And what happens in the jack system is that when you lift a shaft, you're only lifting. And this means that the threads that are lifted are under a different amount of tension than the threads that are not lifted. So you have an inconsistent amount of tension on your loom and on each thread in the loom, and this can be especially difficult for a single ply yarn. That's not to say that it can't be done. You can still weave with single ply yarns on a jack loom. You just need to know that you're operating something that's going to put a little bit more strain on your yarns, and you need to compensate for that. What should you do if you want to weave with singles as warp? The first thing that you need to do is test it for strength, and I have a whole video walking you through how to do that. The second thing you want to do is make sure that it's consistent. You don't want to have thick and thin spots in your yarn, especially if it's single ply, because those are going to be more prone to abrasion and breakage. Again, it can be done. I have done it, but it's something that is going to be a little bit harder to work with and more prone to having broken warp ends. Third, as you're dressing the loom, you want to make sure that you keep your warp under a consistent and pretty firm amount of tension. Remember that a warp under tension is a warp under control. If you're warping by yourself, this might look like weighting your warp so that it stays under tension. It might mean using a warping trapeze. You might use that in combination with weighting your warp, and you might also want to look into using a tool called angel wings, which help you keep a consistent amount of tension as you're winding the warp onto the loom. You might also want to warp your loom back to front, as that technique will put a lot less abrasion on your warp ends than warping front to back. If this is a new technique to you, I have a whole video that explains the difference between the two processes. If your yarn seems hairy, fuzzy, it might be prone to sticking to its neighbors, and that can cause breakages in your warp. In this case, you might want to consider sizing it before you put it on the loom. First, it smooths out the yarns so they're less likely to catch on each other, but it also creates a kind of an armor that protects it from extra abrasion. Then when you go to wash your fabric after you're done weaving it, all those nice fuzzy fibers can stick back out and be nice and soft and give you the texture that you want. So tell me, has this video convinced you that you can totally warp with single ply yarns? Do you have any questions or hesitations that I could help with? Let me know in the comments below. In an upcoming video, I'll be sharing some specific examples of single ply warps that I have used, or in fabrics that I have sewn with that are hand spun, so that you can kind of see that it's totally doable and not scary at all. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time.